YPN co-chairs, Jamila White and Chizi Igwe, who came to us with this idea, the idea of doing this event, but also the first part of this mini series that we started back in August. So we really appreciate your support and your thoughts and the great process you put through to make sure this event ran smoothly. So we appreciate that. I also want to give a shout out to, as you probably can notice, our ASL interpreters for this event, courtesy of Gallaudet University. So I'd like to thank Gallaudet University for also providing ASL interpreters for us. We really do appreciate it. So with that out of the way, I know there are probably a lot of you who aren't familiar with who we are. So I want to take a very brief moment to do that. So we are a neutral convener in the international development space to really provide this opportunities for networking and also information sharing. So this is kind of right in our wheelhouse. We do events like these all the time. We hosted about 63 events last year. So we're always doing something. Check out our website. We have always something going on. I'd like to point out one of our biggest marquee event that we do every year, which was supposed to be in May, but we're now doing it in a few weeks, our annual conference. That is happening on October 7th and 8th. Ticket sales are open. So if you are interested, feel free to check out the website. That all the information's up. The parts of the agenda are also up too, and will be more confirmed as time goes on. So you can see everything there. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you all there and participating in our wonderful panels there and everything that we'll have to offer. So that's all I want to say there. A few things just as we move forward with this event, just some housekeeping. It's going to be mentioned in the chat box already, but please have for this event, because of the fact that we have ASL interpreters, we need to make sure that they are always at the top of the screen. So we do, and I guess most of everybody's done this already, but we request that you have your videos turned off so that everybody can see the ASL interpreters, and those of you who need them can see them. So that's that one, and then two, and then a few other things. If you need to, we'll have questions throughout the event, and our panel will be addressing them. But if you are interested in asking a question to our panel, please feel free to, doesn't matter when, ask a question in the chat box. Jamila and Chizi, our co-chairs, will be addressing them throughout the event, or looking through the chat box and monitoring it. So feel free to ask, doesn't matter when. And that is, I will stop talking because I've talked way too long already. I will hand it off to Jamila, who will get us started and kind of set the groundwork for the event.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for part 2 of our discussion on anti-Blackness and racism in the international development and humanitarian sector. Just want to start with some quick ground rules before I introduce our moderator this morning. We realize that this topic is sensitive. We realize this topic is uncomfortable, and this conversation may be uncomfortable, but in order to have courageous conversations, we have to break through the seas. We ask that everyone please be respectful of all of the participants. Please be respectful, with your comments and questions and the language you use. Please be mindful of the language you use and the other participants in this room. We are here to learn. We're here to come up with solutions and to work together. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ms. Rashida Peterson, who's the Regional Director for the Global Fund for Women. Rashida's career has been built on expertise gained from leading major fundraising and development initiatives across the world, as well as expanding U.S., Africa, and trade and investment relations. Working within development departments of international nonprofits, Rashida has been responsible for annual fundraising goals of more than $16 million in institutional funding and more than $1.3 million in cumulative unrestricted donations. Her steadfast focus on causes with strong community involvement and local impact was to catalyst to establish a consulting firm, 1847 Philanthropic, and technical startup DIA Fund. DIA was a hybrid micro philanthropy platform that connected members of the diaspora in the US with vetted community-based organizations in their home countries, and was developed out of 1847 Philanthropic as a technical solution to the problems of expensive due diligence costs and identification of grassroots organizations. She began her career at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Rashida, I would like to hand it over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Jamila. Jamila and I have known each other for many years and worked together and are great friends. And so I appreciate that long, I should have given you the abbreviation version of the resume. First, I'd just like to express gratitude to Sid Washington, Paul, Jamila, and Cheesy for organizing and continuing to raise these important issues and make space for dialogue, and also for the audience joining us today. As you all know, this is part 2 of a 2-part series. I spent a few days ago listening to part 1 and was able to steep in a lot of gems from that as well. So very excited that we have some pretty awesome speakers that are joining us today to talk through, as Jamila mentioned, trying to find our way through, I think, what are some really difficult times ahead, not just for, the United States of America, how we do development work, but also just the world, and the turmoil and the trauma that we are going through today. So I'm excited that we have, 3 really amazing panelists that are going to be talking to us today. Before I do that, though, just building off of part 1, we actually wanted to do a quick Menti poll to start. We wanted to ask a few questions, well, actually just one, to begin the process to understand where kind of everyone is in terms of, understanding what decolonizing international development is, and to begin the process of centering Black lives. Where do you personally feel like you would start in this process? I believe we are going to be doing that Menti now, that Menti poll. So if you wouldn't mind using your cell phone and going to www.menti.com and use the code right on the top of the screen, you can, let's see, 5 choices, 6 choices. And we just want to kind of get an understanding of like where you would start as you begin this process of centering Black lives and decolonizing international development. Just going to take a quick minute to start to see. Okay. 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 Okay, this is helpful. This is really helpful. Thank you so much for, thank you so much. So it seems like sort of overwhelmingly looking at focusing on changing the narrative through increased historical training and context is by far in the #1 lead. And then we can talk a little bit about identifying harmful hiring practices and putting forward more inclusive practices and addressing workforce development and staff. Okay, perfect. So I think this is great. Well, you guys are actually in, you are gonna love this panel today because I'd like to introduce, to start, Dr. Millington Bergsom Lockwood, who is the head of Innovation and Learning Advisor with USAID's mission in Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He's also a historian, which I am super excited about him lending that expertise and in being part of this conversation. In part of his work in the mission in Kinshasa, he has designed and led sessions on the history of anti-Black racism in the United States for the US government staff at USAID and US embassies around the world. As I mentioned, he holds a master's degree and PhD in history from the University of Michigan. And his specialization was in studying African-American history, race, and racism in the United States. He's written a lot of articles about this. Y'all can Google him. It's amazing. The next panelist, I would say my sister and co-conspirator in a lot of things, and sort of my vision for my Everything Black Collective, which y'all will hear about later on. Stephanie Kimu, who is the Director of Programming and just an amazing woman, who founded PopWorks Africa. She's an international development professional that really looks at intersectional work, but I would say that that she has a specialization in sexual reproductive health and women's rights and gender. She is also a specialist in social entrepreneurship, speaks fluent French, being from Francophone Africa, has really led, I think, I believe, the Black International Women's Facebook group, the start of that, and sort of created spaces for Black women to really thrive in sometimes hostile environments in international NGOs. She is joining us today. And also joining us today is Jennifer Williams, who is the Executive Director of FSM Alliance, which is a global sanitary NGO based in the Netherlands. She has experience in working in nonprofit organizations in the United States. The interesting thing I find about Jennifer's career is she started in philanthropy in the US, working in small grassroots organization in Seattle, focused on HIV, AIDS, and education, and then went to sort of the mothership of philanthropy at the Gates Foundation, where she focused on water, sanitation, and hygiene, and now has continued her work now as the executive director, sort of going back into the nonprofit space and sort of this grassroots angle. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington. So I just wanted to let you all know just the caliber of the panelists that we have today and how exciting this is gonna be. So I just wanna get started because I know we have limited time and I'm sure everyone is excited to understand where we should start in this sort of just cluster of decolonizing international development. So I want to start by saying, by actually defining a couple of things that came out of our last, the part one of this series. So first, I want to start by defining white supremacy culture, which was a theme that came up quite a bit in the last panel. And white supremacy culture is the idea that white people and the ideas, thoughts, benefits, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, benefits, and actions. And we see this, obviously white supremacy culture is artificial, as is race, but we see this in sort of the binding in the glue of white controlled institutions. And this anti-Blackness or white supremacy culture is deeply ingrained in the aid sector. And so this was identified in part one. In part two, we're gonna talk about, where do we go from here? Like, how do we, as international development professionals, identify our work in promoting racist ideas and culture, and how do we take steps to bring change in this sector? So I want to start by asking the panelists, And I'm interested in understanding from each of you how you currently see our system of foreign aid, both official and philanthropic. Where do you see the actors and who benefits? And I think we'll start there. Why don't we start with you, Millington, our historian?
Sure. Thank you, Rashida, and thank you, SID, for having us all here today. And I think one of the things that I think is important, there's a lot of discussion these days about systemic or structural racism in America, and I think that that's a useful lens to apply when we're talking about international development. That when there's one definition of systemic racism that I really like comes from the Aspen Institute, and it describes systemic racism as a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. And I think that that's it's useful to think about international development through that lens. And that when we talk about racism, when we talk about anti-racism in the context of international development, to understand it on a systemic level. So to think about it as, it's not the matter of, oh, well, the big donors need to do this, or we need to make development more local here. Like, I think if we look at it as a systemic level, as a cultural issue, as a historical issue, as a policy issue, I think then we can start to dismantle some of the structures that are reinforcing those dynamics. And so, yeah, and so that's the first thing. And I think it's also, as the historian, and I'm pleased to see that the audience would agree with me, that I think it starts by understanding the history and understanding the history behind these power structures, how these systems became ingrained, not just in the local context, but in our own countries, how our own, speaking of the United States, how our own struggles with racism are reflected in the way that we do development, how as we struggle with our own systemic racism domestically, how our international development policy fits into that same system, how it reinforces ideas of blackness, of race, that were forged in the American context. Yeah, and so I think that it's crucial to make history a part of our conversations, and really the fundamental foundation of anti-racist progress. And I think that's a great place to start. Thank you.
Thank you. That's helpful for that. I'm so excited that you are on this call, because I just love the history lens. I think it's very important. So Jennifer, why don't you give us an idea from working both in philanthropy and also, sort of this tension sometimes in who has the money and, trying to do good work with the funds, and sort of finding funds to do the work that you're doing. Where do you see, this culture of racism and oppression, and how do you understand it in terms of our current system? Who benefits, and how can we move that along to closer in that regard?
Thank you, Rashida, and thank you to SID for organizing the panel on this important topic. Yeah, I think it's interesting. As I experience kind of the global international sector outside of the US, I think that I see a lot of the national development agencies really continuing to hire from within their own countries. And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating system. So they hire staff from within their own countries. They don't look at expertise from the field, for example, or from varying countries. And then this is continued through sometimes the consulting firms that are hired to help support the work are also based from that same country. And so while we see that some of the targeted recipients of the international development space do benefit, we see a lot of the system continuing to self-perpetuate by continuing to hire the same types of people with the same types of credentials, from the same types of institutions. And not that those institutions are bad, it's just one experience. And I think if we're really looking to change the system, we need to bring in diversity of thought, and we need to rethink about what different types of diversity as well. So not just racial or gender, but even institutional background, for example.
Yeah, it's great that you bring up that point. So, Stephanie, I know you've been on multiple panels talking about racism and aid, and I applaud you for continuing to have these conversations. I followed your career in collective organizing, and I know you have a lot of thoughts about, you know, the different actors in foreign assistance and who benefits. I mean, I think from the perspective of, you know, in country, what do you think about what Jennifer just said about, you know, hiring staff from within and continuing to perpetuate the system? Like, how do we identify and start to change some of these structures?
Yeah, I think I've been saying this a lot on some panels and in some pieces I've been writing, but I feel like international development isn't ready yet to have a reckoning with racism and colonization and the vestiges of colonization and how the manifestations of white supremacy, or I call it the myth of white supremacy culture, is kind of perpetuated. And so I think we're not ready to actually name that. People aren't ready to put the lens on them to say, wow, the poverty porn that we've used to raise these millions of dollars is really problematic. But I think what people are ready to do is reduce the harm quietly. They're taking some time to analyze how is the myth of white supremacy manifesting in our institution, and how can we stop that cycle of perpetuation that Jennifer was talking about. And so it's I find it to be kind of sad that we still, as an international development sector, are not ready to name anti-Black racism, anti-Black women racism specifically. But I think there are pockets within different institutions and within different foundations that are kind of quietly really interrogating themselves and investing in reducing harm. And I think the people who are in the best place to reduce harm in some of these international development interventions are Black women and women of color who actually have lived through certain levels of harm, and so are in a position to talk about and ask the right questions to protect the communities they say they're in service of. And so I'm not sure if I really answered the question, but I do feel like the self-perpetuating cycle is real, but it can be interrupted by being intentional about reducing harm.
I'm so happy that you are on this panel, because I mean, I almost feel like crying, because I totally agree with you. And I think that we should be honest with ourselves about where we are. And so I'm really glad that you are naming that and saying, okay, listen, we get it, you know, because I've struggled with this as well, right? Being a development person. I mean, not now, luckily, the Global Fund for Women is very progressive, but you know, previously, you know, you're raising money and you're kind of up against your goal and up against wanting to do good work, and you're, I mean, as we all do as development professionals, no one gets in this for, you know, to make buku bucks. I mean, there are easier ways, right? I mean, there are easier ways. And I think it's great that you mentioned, like, how can we invest in reducing harm as a first step? And I want to kind of build on that, to go to you, Millington, in terms of some of the programs that you've been putting together, understanding that, you know, you're not here in your official capacity, but just as, you know, a historian and as a person who's been close to these issues, you know, have you seen in some of the trainings that you've done, like, what do you think about Stephanie's comment about, you know, investing in reducing harm as like a first step? You know, particularly for those folks who are on the call who are like, where do I start?
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point. And I think that sort of in Stephanie's comment is that, that people matter, right? We talk about these institutions as if they're like Leviathan, right? As if they're these like monsters that don't actually have people behind them. And I think that, we forget that it's people doing the work, it's people setting the policies, people making the hiring decisions. And so the position that I've taken and that USAID has taken through some of our work around these issues in the last couple of months is that, if you can, educate, and I think we saw this, that there's a desire for education on these topics, that if you can educate people, they're in a better position to make the kind of small changes that are really the start of a larger anti-racist movement. And so the programs that we've done, we did a lot of listening sessions with local staff, with USAID staff around these issues. And one of the things that came up was this desire for history. And it came from two areas. One, there was a need among American staff for more candid discussions about our own history with racism, but also a desire on the part of local staff abroad to understand the struggles that America was having and the origins of some of those conflicts. And so we put together a presentation on the history of anti-Black racism in America from enslavement through COVID-19, and started doing these with USAID missions abroad, with US embassies abroad, and they were really well received. And I think that there was, a lot of surprise at the depth of our own problems with this. And I think a way to, I hope, take this issue seriously, have people take the issue as being deeply ingrained, and to mobilize people to act. And I think, so that's part, and that's sort of an internal conversation. The other part, I think, is to show that the United States struggles with our own conflicts over racism and inequality, and that we shouldn't go out into the world as a leader, but really as an authentic partner, as coming from a place of humility and saying that we don't have all the answers when it comes to these. Clearly, we don't have the answers, and that are there ways to form meaningful partnerships around this that put us in a position to learn. So to look at how post-conflict reconciliation has happened in countries, and lessons from that, to how we might sort of resolve some of our own conflicts. And so I think that that's at the heart of some of the work that I've done, is to on the one hand educate, but on the other hand really open up opportunities for real authentic partnership. That is a partnership based on humility, a partnership based on mutual understanding of where we are.
No, I really appreciate that. I was writing down, a couple of things that you had mentioned: education, humility. Going just back to the poll about, the number one thing that came up in terms of people feeling like where we can start, is changing the narrative. So, Jennifer, do you want to just talk a little bit about your experience with philanthropy, and what role can philanthropy play in changing some of the narrative around what I like to say? You think that you're on your high horse, but your horse is really a donkey. And how we can come and approach our work with more humility, understand that we're human. And what role does philanthropy play in that, in harming, and also can philanthropy play in moving some of this work forward in terms of the narrative specifically?
Yeah, I think it goes to what Stephanie already mentioned about shifting away from the poverty porn and the different types of messages and campaigns that we use to fundraise specifically. But I think it also really comes down to listening, as Millington said, humility and listening, active listening, not just listening to think about what you're going to say next, but active listening and having more two-way conversations. So I attended, when we could still attend conferences, I attended a conference in December, and I'm working with a group of Pan-African sanitation actors, which is primarily manual pit emptiers. and the deputy president wanted our organization's assistant to help organize a training. And so I was speaking very openly with her. What are the specific skills that they were looking to build? Where did she need our help? And she kept trying to come back to me looking for guidance of how our organization wanted to shape the training. And I finally looked at her and I said, no, tell me what you need. And the shock on her face, the way that I asked the question, the shock was so surprising, and it was so visceral for me, her reaction, because her face read like she had never really been asked that question in a real way. And then I also followed on with, is there something that our organization is better placed to say than your organization? Because we know how that works too. Some messages are better received when they come from the outside, and some messages are better received when they come from the inside. But let's be coordinated and talk about which ones are which and which ones are appropriate. And I still think about her face and the shock on her face as I think about my work and the work that our organization does every day, because it was such an impactful moment for me. So I really think listening to our dialogue and also shifting our mindset a little bit on not thinking as aid recipients as beneficiaries, but stakeholders or clients or consumers, that automatically changes the dynamic.
You know, I think that's an important point about, language as well. I was reading a document as I was preparing for this panel, and it was, going into defining white supremacy culture and, just how much we're all seeped in it, and trying to identify and pull out some of these very important pieces about culture. And one of those things was language. And language, images, it builds up in your mind and creates this narrative. And even for people of color, as a Black woman, your point about being in the room and kind of having to play both sides in some instances, being an international development person, but also being a Black person, and seeing sometimes, as you mentioned, the shock or the active listening, wanting to connect, but understanding that you're interpreting almost, right? And I want to go to you, Stephanie, to really understand, because I know that you put together a few tools for getting at this dismantling. And I'm really interested if you've seen any examples of ways or tools that we could pull for our work that would help us identify some of these damaging narratives, and then also work towards, once you identify, how do you change language? How do you change that narrative?
Yeah, I think what's important for me to always say in these spaces, because I often get those questions of like examples of frameworks or tools or even words, exact sentences to say when certain things happen. And I think I want to name that as like a manifestation of all of us being so worried about the white gaze. Like, what are white people thinking? What are white people feeling? Do white people understand this? Do they not understand this? What language should I use? And so before I answer that question, I just want to say that and name as Black women how much labor we've already put in to giving so many institutions and so many program officers and directors and CEOs our true perspectives as Black women working in service of Black people, but being led by white folks, of how things should change and how things should be. And so before we talk about all the tools, I think we should recognize also how triggering this has been as Black women and people of color to see an entire sector wake up to racism, wake up to colonization in the last maybe 3 months. And so Like, let's name it, because I know why you posed that question, because that's why a lot of the 171 people are probably a lot of well-intentioned, well-meaning white folks who want to hear the answers. And so I like to challenge people to say, especially women on this call who have worked on gender as a theme, an uncompromising theme, like a vehicle for transformation. How can we be gender transformative? Like that was an uncompromising platform that led to a lot of transformation in the international development sector. And it was led by a lot of powerful white women. And so we already know what the tools are needed. We already know who needs to say the things. We already know all these things. People are just scared to do it for race and racism and colonization. And so I hope in these spaces we can shift the narrative from what should we do to what would you as a human being want, you know? Because if an institution is asking me, what are the tools to really look at problematic policies within our work? It's like, how do you exist? You've at least done some analysis of your institution on some level. So how is it so paradigm shifting to think about things you've done for your institution before, focusing on racist practice? Like all of this already exists. All of it, the frameworks already exist. There's a lot of lazy people in international development, and nobody wants to do the work. No one wants to pay Black people and brown people to do the work. And I think we just have to really call it out before we continue to give people free answers to things. We didn't make this up, Rashida.
Right.
Jennifer, as a woman of color, didn't make this up.
Right.
Like, we're living in someone else's dream, as Octavia Butler says, like a nightmare a little bit. And now we have to also give answers. And so I probably won't answer that question the way you'd like me to, but I really want
I'm liking your answer right now.
Okay, I'll stop there and just I'd love to hear your reaction to it.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I'm trying to be the good moderator now, so so you have to give me credit for that. But yeah, no, I think you're absolutely 100% correct. And so, I think our organization at the Global Fund for Women, we had recently a training which was, I think, very eye-opening for me. That basically was like, how do we center Black lives in the work that we do? Because really, I think that's getting to the point in what you're saying. And you should, and we all should be waking up every moment of every day, breathing and wanting to breathe in Blackness, right? Because, let's just be real. It has given so much to the world. In so many ways. So I think that maybe that is the question that we should be asking. Milton, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think one of the things that came up as I was given these presentations was the like sort of shock and disbelief by well-meaning white people that this history existed. This is not new history, right? Like, well, the history of enslavement, the history of Jim Crow, the history of redlining and residential segregation, the history of colonialism, the history of U.S. incursions abroad. This is not a hidden history, right? Like, this has been well documented, particularly by scholars of color, for the last, at least the last century. And so this is not a hidden history. This is not like something that requires secret decoding, especially in the age of Google, where, if I can go online and find out like what to make out of the ingredients I have in my cupboard, surely I can go online and find out about this history. The difference is that, white people are too privileged to ask the question, right? And that part of white privilege is feeling like that you don't have to ask those questions, right? Because you can exist in the world without having to know the answers. And I think that what the last couple months have done is it's shaken people to say, wait, maybe the world that I have existed in and have created for myself, maybe that is not in fact the world that I'm living in. and it's made people wake up to, you know, if you look at the New York Times best-selling list in the last, you know, the last 3 decades or the last 3 months, right? Like everybody is hungry for doing this. But I also think that, so there's, and so I'm a big proponent of education. I think this is great. But I also think that these are not, you cannot understand your way out of these problems, right? You know, you cannot, I think there's an idea that if I read the right books, if I listen to the right podcasts, if I follow the right people on Twitter, that somehow that will inoculate me from racism, that will somehow, you know, cleanse me of my white supremacy, right? And I think that my worry is that people are going to get the right books on their bookshelves, but then they're going to move on once they finish that book, or maybe they don't even read the book. Maybe they just buy it because, you know, it looks good in the background of a Zoom call. But I do think that understanding is only the first step, right? And now's the time for action. And I think that's when the rubber will really hit the road, right? It's so you can read all about this history, but then when it comes, like, if you're in a position as a development worker to make some of these real, so when it comes to the hiring decisions you're making, when it comes to if you're on a procurement panel, and it comes to the organizations that you're assigning contracts to, you know, are you taking what you learned in the last 3 months and applying that to make some of this meaningful, right? Like, Black lives can't just matter on paper, right? They can't just matter when it's easy, right? They have to matter when it requires sacrifice, and when it requires white people giving up a little bit of power, and that's when you'll find out how much they really matter.
Well, absolutely. And I, you know, I go back and forth because I you know, I look at like Angela Davis, you know, and saying freedom is a constant struggle and freedom ain't free. And so you kind of gotta wonder, and it's great. I think your points are well taken, Millington. But at some point, I think then the question is going to be like, when do you move as white people out of spaces? When do you co-conspire, and then when do you move out of the way, right? And allow other people who have, you know, better knowledge, local folks on the ground that can't, you know, decide like some foundation that they're going to change their topic, and then be focusing now on something else, right? And so then the funding goes away. You know, when are we going to start having that conversation, and that conversation about accountability? I know that we're going to be moving to the Q&A section pretty soon. So Jennifer, I just want to, you know, ask you to quickly wrap up that question about, you know, where do we go from here in terms of accountability? How do we start to hold some of these institutions accountable, and how can we individually and collectively start to set shit on fire, so to speak?
Yeah, I think you know, one the people took away my message really well. I think we really need to, non-Black people, we need to take that onus onto ourselves. And we also really
Jennifer,
need to—
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you just were freezing a bit. Can you go ahead and start again?
Sure, yes, sorry. Yeah, I got to notice my internet was a little unstable. We've talked a lot about education, but I think it's also taking that one step further to add on to what Millington said, is we really all need to internalize how the entire system of colonialization and then the slave trade was built around dehumanizing people so that they could be captured, transported, and sold to the highest bidder as a commodity. And the dehumanization that was required to do that, to have everyone who was involved in the slave trade sleep well at night, and how that was built into every system to maintain control over an economic good, if you will, we really need to start to internalize that and really look deep at how the US in particular was built on that, but also how other countries contributed to that as well. Because the Dutch take a little bit of a hands-off approach now that I'm living in the Netherlands, right? But they were involved in the slave trade as well as merchants. So they contributed here, and there's an ongoing conversation here about a blackface practice that happens every year around Christmas, and it's a highly controversial topic. So we really need to internalize what this all means. Reading the books, that's fine. Listening to the podcast, that's fine. But I think we all just really need to look at how this system played out and how deeply entrenched it is. But I also think, totally separately, it's small things, right? Standing up for colleagues when we see microaggressions when they happen every day, thinking about how we can also shift our hiring and promotion metrics. We continue to hire and promote based on credentials, and we give more weight to credentials from elite institutions who have more likely been promoting white supremacy culture. So I think we really need to shift on looking at shifting our focus to experiences and different experiences that people have, because implementing a project in West Africa and actually doing the work is not anything you're ever going to learn on your way to get a PhD or in a master's course. And I think we also need to focus on soft skills like communication and emotional intelligence and listening, as I said before.
Thank you so much. That was a great recap. So I'm just going to, and keep your questions coming. I'm going to try my best to try and take the rest of this time to answer, to pose some of your questions to the panel. And just want to thank you all for bringing your full selves today. I mean, we could talk about this for a long time, but I really appreciate you all's perspective, and I appreciate the work that you've done to carry this burden. It is a burden, boy. Okay, so let's see. Can you share a time an organization fully involved the local country? The word empowered kind of irks me a little bit, but because it's like, anyway, so that's not a critique on that. I get it. To make their own decisions, has any of you seen a time where we actually really, where an organization really actually just funded something that wasn't bullshit? Anyone on the panel can take that. Well, I can start, given that, I am representing my organization, Global Fund for Women. We actually do have a really strong feminist approach to our funding that basically is completely unrestricted, multi-year funding that looks at basically putting money in the hands of activists that are really doing the actual work. And some of the trauma and some of the calls that I've been on and some of the work that our activists are doing, it's like personally painful to hear some of their stories. And I think that we have to do better, because still our funding comes from majority white women that are around the age of 60, and I think that there's so much to be said about white feminists and how that has really propped up white supremacy culture, and so I won't really necessarily go there, but I do think that it comes down to money and jobs in some instances, and if you can't do the work, sometimes I feel like just shut up and give the money to people who can. And so I'll just give that as an example. But have any of you guys, Jennifer, I know you're now running your organization and doing great work. I mean, have you had instances where you've just been directly either, giving, making connections, and then there's been funding directly to particular projects, or any examples that you have?
We're a relatively new organization, so just since January. So no specific examples of funding being directed yet, but I'm hopeful. I think one of the interesting areas, one of the interesting networks that I'm seeing right now is the African Women Sanitation Network, which was organized by African women on the continent themselves, with the aim of really, again, moving African women out of the beneficiary role and into a financial contributor, a decision maker, a stakeholder, so that they can be part of developing solutions while also bringing more African women into the sanitation space as well. So I am hopeful that they will get some funding soon, but they're an organization that I'm constantly in touch with, trying to figure out is there any way that our organization can support them. I think also, for the first time, I am in a very significant decision-making role in the organization that I work at. So I'm also able, for the first time, to really bring in some of these practices and ideas, and be really thoughtful about how the organization is set up, and how I can create an organizational culture on a lot of these principles that we're talking about today. So that is really exciting. We're shaping everything in Moment right now, from HR practice to hiring, and we're a small organization, so we have the flexibility to do that. And so I think that's probably the most exciting for me right now.
Thank you. I'm going to keep going because there's some really incredible questions that are being asked. So this question from Chloe, talking about wanting to know how we tangibly go about breaking down the donor-recipient structures that permit and perpetuate dependence on white power and privilege, white authorities controlling the purse and determining what causes are deserving of funds. Like, how do we, I think that's a hard question, but break down these avenues and work towards breaking down these structures to promote equal, locally driven work.
Yeah, I can. I'll take a stab at that as the the person who works for a big donor. I think it comes by reshaping the values and some of the mindset that we put ourselves in, and it even goes, I think, in part to thinking about the language that we use. And there are some scholars of anti-racism and development that really talk about shifting the language from assistance to justice. And so what would it mean to shift that relationship as one not based around aid or assistance, but really around justice, right? And so when we start talking about justice, when we start talking about equity, that I think shifts some of the ways that we think about the work that we do. I think that and I think a lot of people point to localization. They say, like, okay, local ownership is the answer, right? We're just going to shift the power locally, right? But I think we want to do that in a way that doesn't let, for lack of the global north off the hook, right? That is there a way that we can merge the ethics of local ownership with reparative and restorative justice on the part of nations that built their wealth on these countries, right? And so, are there ways in which, while advancing, local ownership, while keeping the power local, you don't put the global north in a position to throw its hands up and say, okay, well, now it's all local, we're just going to go about our business. Like, is there a way that we can imagine a reshaping, right? And I like this idea of, thinking about, like, who's the architect and who's the tool, right? And providing local architects, right? They're the ones making the plans. They're the ones making the decisions. And they go to, a big donor to say, okay, here's what we need. We have the plans, we have the workers, but what we need is X, Y, and Z, and have the donor in a position to provide that. And to cede some of that control. But I think it does, just to get back to, I think it comes from a mindset of justice, and not as assistance, not as looking at nations as those without, but saying, no, like, we want to come together as partners in a justice mission.
Gina, can I add something to that?
Yes.
So I think this is kind of radical, and I've said this a few times, but I think who I am as a Black woman, as an African, dark-skinned immigrant woman, I don't think using words like justice, equity, and local ownership are transformative in international development. I think it's just more palatable for white people, and it gives them a longer timeline. It doesn't seem as urgent. I mean, we're talking about reparations, are we not? Because to Millington's point, if I'm an architect and I'm going to a donor and I'm saying, this is what I need to build, sure, but what I'm really saying is, you owe me. You took a lot of shit from my plot that I had, and you owe me this. And so if that's the lens we're talking about in international development, then we're not even talking about local ownership. It's like, you don't even have to tell us what's owned by us anymore. Like, this is our reality now, because you owe us, you're giving it back, and then you're moving out of the way. And so I just challenge us to not make the aim of these discussions for it to be palatable for white people and for them to feel comfortable. Because white people don't feel comfortable with reparations. They don't feel comfortable with some of these really Black frameworks. But we have to push back, because I don't actually talk about equity or local ownership or certain frameworks in my work, because I don't believe in it. I definitely believe that especially Africans, especially Caribbeans, especially descendants of African slaves deserve reparations holistically from the diaspora to the continent. And I think international development could be a vehicle for that.
Woo. Yes. Okay, we are cooking with grease. So I just want to appreciate those comments, and just as a small call out, because we are joined, but just in general, by our interpreters provided by Gallaudet University, that we also need to consider the intersection of other identities that are also marginalized, such as, those that are deaf and those that have disabilities. I think that, thank you for that, Professor, and for bringing that into the conversation. And we definitely also believe in sort of indigenous reparations as well. Just to move us along, I could say so many things about reparations, but I'm going to be a great moderator to keep it flowing here. I think the other question that is really interesting, there's like 40 questions, so I'm really going to do my best, y'all. How do we take care of ourselves along the way? Because I think, Stephanie, you alluded to this earlier, and just how exhausting this work can be, and how do we not become, to your point about taking the first step and everyone being able to be comfortable now, and okay, now we can do kumbaya and everyone feels comfortable, and then us as people who have to carry this burden just getting exhausted by this process. What are your thoughts on how we actually can care for ourselves in this process of working in these careers as Black women, as people of color, as co-conspirators?
You want me to answer, Rashida? Or Jennifer, do you want
anyone can take that, actually.
Yeah, I guess I'll take a stab. I think we need to support each other and listen. And so, when someone calls, answer the phone. And I think we also need to understand the difference between empathy and sympathy, because sympathy, we think that sympathy is empathy, but it's actually not. Sympathy actually takes a little bit away from the person who's coming to you with the problem. And so shifting that a little bit. And I think let's not as women, we often forget about ourselves, right? We often take care of everybody else first. And so I think we need to stop thinking of self-care as a luxury. So my friend has made fun of me in the past that I didn't have like a beauty squad. I had like a self-care squad, and I stick to my appointments. I do my things. I make time for it, and I treat it as important as I prep for this panel. So I think that's really important. I just recently stole Self-Care Sunday, or I have adopted the concept in my own life, Self-Care Sunday. Yeah.
No, that's awesome. No, it takes a lot of emotional labor to do this work, and it's exhausting. And I'm glad that you are caring for yourself, Jennifer. And I really like the fact that you mentioned also like being there for others when they come to you with challenges and problems. I mean, Stephanie, shout out to you for organizing that Black Women in Development space, for us to be able to sometimes you just need to vent about the craziness that is happening in the world and be in a safe space to feel cared for. So, just to add to that in terms of being kind to ourselves. Just moving along with the questions, because y'all are hitting me with so many questions today. It's like, what are some actions or steps employees can take to promote anti-racism within their organization? I mean, I think we talked a lot about that. Again, I think I would flip that question on the side and say, like, how are you personally going to center Black lives, marginalized lives, those that have disabilities within your organization and within your daily life? And I'm sure you can come up with many things that you can do as first steps, close to home and then in your work. And I think that should be, a start for questions like that. Okay, ooh, so much praise. Boom, there it is. Yes, yes, yes. In terms of more questions, oh, wait, are there no more questions, guys? Wait, questions on, next topic, reparations and international development. Yes, that could be a topic on its own. When I think about reparations, I actually like to talk about it in terms of capitalism. And I like to talk about it in terms of the fact that we want to be promoting democracy and capitalism, which we can talk about, capitalism another time. But if you believe in that system, then there is an unpaid invoice that is due and has been due for 400 plus years. And we want our check, okay? And so you can call me, I can tell you where to mail it. But it's less about, to me, it's less about a racial thing. It's like, if you believe in capitalism and you believe that people should be paid for their time and their work, like we all get our paycheck every 2 weeks, right? And like, y'all better have my money. Don't act like you forgot. And I continue to show up for work, that's what it is. Then yeah, then that's what it is. Like, there was work done, and there has continued to be work due, and people should be paid for it. And I think to me, it's not even like we don't even need to bring in the other complexities into it, because then that bogs it down. And then I have to make a justification for why like all of these terrible things have happened to Black people. And to me, I think that convolutes it. It's just like, where is our money? Period. So,
Rashida, can I add something to that? Yeah.
Yes,
so
please.
I think that this is where also, I talked in my opening about how the intersections between how the United States understands its own racial issues and how that's transposed on the world, right? And the one way I think about it is the way in which the language around poverty has been racialized, right? And the way in which we talk about a culture of poverty, and the sort of hyper racial overtones that comes with, right? And when we talk about dependency, when we talk about how poor people should act, and the way that that's racialized, and the way that we transpose that onto the world. You know, when we talk about a language of, you know, independence, when we talk about a language of self-reliance, right? You know, we are imbuing this. I think we need to be careful when we're using words like that, that we are remembering that those words were also used to deny, especially poor people, of poor Black people in America, economic equality, right? That when we talk about that, oh, there's some sort of like that, oh, they have that, you know, people abroad in developing countries, oh, they have this culture that prevents them from advancing. They have this, like, you can mask those in all the anthropological terms that you want, but it's racism, like, and that's part of the reckoning. And so I think when we talk about reparations, one of the big barriers is we're using the people who fight against reparations are the same ones who fight against welfare, the same ones who fight against economic justice in America, and they're using the same language. And so I think that that's important to understand. How America treats its poor people of color is the same way it's going to treat poor people of color overseas.
Absolutely. Do others have thoughts on that? I mean, Millington, you're giving me all of the backup that we need for all of the comments that we've been saying. And I appreciate that, because I think that there's such urgency for us to really get to the bottom of what I like to call this foolishness of racism. Because, you know, it's just really holding us back. And so I'm happy, Millington, that you're helping us to identify some of these things that we traditionally have, and the anti-Blackness that is so seeped in the culture that we have been promoting as development. Like, I, as a development person, you know, like development in terms of fundraising, have written so many times about self-reliance, not realizing that that is, like you said, just so seeped in anti-Blackness. And so I really appreciate you for you know, linking those and helping us to recognize that. It's really helpful. Do we have
there was a question I saw in the group chat.
Please jump in there.
There's a lot going on there. It was Christine from USAID, and there was a question about how do we balance the urgency of change now with the need to have meaningful reflection about the history and the education. Is there a balance we're trying to strike, and if so, how do we get there? And it wasn't for any particular speaker, so please feel free to jump in.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I think it is, so she mentions a little, she says, I find that in the eagerness for immediacy, responses are not fully focused enough on problematic structural issues and stay on the surface. So trying to balance the need to act with urgency, but also creating space for meaningful and necessary reflection and interrogation to ensure your organization's responses are not performative. Well, I mean, I think that that's not done enough. You can see, like, with all the Black Lives Matter solidarity statements that were put out there, you could tell that that was, I think, an example of sort of this, like, oh my God, Black people are dying in the street. Like, hello, this has been happening for forever. But obviously seeing, you know, a man lose literally the breath and calling out for his mother. I mean, if you aren't you know, moved by that, then then I really question like humanity, and I hope that Jesus comes like sooner than later, because for real. But I think that's a good example of that, right? Like a lot of corporations, a lot of organizations were very quick to put these solidarity Black Lives Matter statements out there without really probably understanding their own roles in sort of promoting anti-Blackness. And just, you know, I mean, I know personally that I went behind and took a look at with some of these solidarity statements at their leadership, particularly for those that put out statements. And you know, I work for folks now, so I can't put, you know, my real thoughts sometimes out here. But in the fundraising space, and looked, and they were all white, and I was like, "Are you serious? Like, you can't." I mean, for real.
Surprise! They're all white all the time.
I know, but I mean, it's just like, don't even put it out there because it's just disrespectful.
But you know what, Rashida, can I say something about that?
Yeah.
I feel like it's similar, like if you have a close friend and you hurt your close friend, you didn't know you hurt them, you've just been oblivious, the first thing you have to do is apologize. Right. The second thing is to rebuild your trust with that friend by taking certain actions. You're taking them to lunch, you're buying them a gift, you're scheduling a counseling session, right? You might fuck up some of those in-between pieces, but you continuously keep acting because you care about this friend. You don't want them to be mad at you. You want them to know you're so sorry, you were oblivious. Like, and so I think it's similar. I feel like if you really care about Black people on the continent, in the Caribbean, Latinx people, Indigenous people, you will speak out on people you care about, and it won't feel forced. But then the real thing is, what are the different actions you have to take to build trust? And I think we all know how to build trust, unless some of us are like sociopaths. We know how to build trust with communities. You know, you move out of the way. You give them unrestricted funding to support their institutional development. You remove the white gaze with the monitoring and evaluation log frames. There's a way to build trust and solidarity. We know how to do it. People just haven't done it with Black folks. If we're talking about the right now, you know, we're in September 2020. We're talking about what Black people right now. This call was created because Black people in America are dying. So if this is our frame of reference, we're here because a lot of people didn't care about Black folks. And so now we got to start acting like we care about Black folks, and people don't know where to start. It's like if you cared about someone in your life, you know how to care about the Black people on your block, the Black people in your house, the Black people in your office, your Black dog. There's a lot of Black people around. I'm sure we know them. It's like, I get so triggered by these questions that I didn't realize it till this call. Like, I don't think I'll be able to answer them anymore. What are examples? What should we do? How do we build solidarity? It's like, are all of you guys sociopaths? Are all of you guys don't have no people you love in your life? Like, I think we have to challenge people to like dig within and see who are the closest people to you. How do you show them love? How do you show them solidarity? How do you move out of their way? How do you resource them, do what the shit they want to do? I don't know why it seems so difficult with Black folks, maybe.
Rashida, can I add on something to that? I think that we also need to, I know the philanthropy and development work has gotten really metric heavy, right? What is the monitoring and evaluation? What are the key KPIs? How are we going to monitor? How are we going to measure? What's the data? What is the data telling us? Sometimes we just need to listen to our hearts and our stomachs, because our hearts and our stomachs haven't had this framework placed on them the way that our minds have. So let's let go of the importance of something being a peer-reviewed, evidence-based, blah, blah, blah. And let's just go with, what does your heart tell you? What does your stomach tell you? Because at the end of the day, then the person will always know that your intention was based there and not in a framework that was built up through years of education. Let's rely on our hearts and our stomachs and really look at that to guide us a little bit more, because I think we've gotten so concerned with data, and data we know can be manipulated and it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and we could argue about it for hours. But our intentions and our hearts, if we're not a sociopath, to Stephanie's point, those are usually true. And let's think about the golden rule, right? How do we want to be treated? Let's start there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And
Jennifer
I just want
for president. Jennifer for president.
yeah, we're changing 2020. Okay, so this is really great. This conversation has, been a lot, and I appreciate everyone for hanging in and for having this conversation. It's important. I do want to in the final couple of words, because I think there are folks on here that have been trying to hold leaders accountable to what is being discussed. And I think, Stephanie, this is why you created Black Women in International Development, right? Because a lot of us I left international development for this very reason. I got written up so many times, y'all don't even want to know. I had so many grievance things going, woo child. And I feel like this is a real thing, right? Because, how do you challenge your organization and keep these issues front of mind for decision makers? I think in my personal experience, you have to be ready to leave. I'm just gonna keep it 100 with you. You have to be ready to leave. You have to be ready to fight. You have to be ready to leave. Because even if you win, and the win will be glorious, could be glorious, depending on what battle you take on, you have to, you may not win the long term. So I think that's something that you have to, weighs heavy with some of us that are in this space that have worked in and out of, possibly government or implementers, and just knowing when, my friend says you got to have, you're ready to walk out the door money. He didn't say it like that, but your stash, just like I have my bail money, just in case. My mom, who I think is on the call, has access to it, because you never know when you're going to need it. So any other thoughts on, that's real, any other thoughts on, how we hold people accountable and how you do that in an organization that may not be having this as top of mind? Like, how do you work on that?
I mean, so I think it requires, and this is where I think like white people want to know what to do. White people, be that annoying white guy who is bothering the mission director about this. Say like, you guys put out this Black Lives Matter statement in July. What have you done? Like, don't leave it to the people of color in your office to lead this. Like, they can lead it, but like, you be the annoying guy. Like, that way they can do their jobs and not have to be like the annoying person. Like, I'm fine. I'm happy being the annoying person. Like, I'm super annoying. So I think that like that, I think that, but that in part like takes courage, right? It takes like, so right now, that there's a little bit of pushback about these diversity inclusion councils, whatever, that are happening, right? And I think so people are now like, uh-oh, now we might get in trouble for some of what we're talking about. Now is the time for courage, right? Now is the time to step up when like the rubber meets the road. And now you might actually have, as a white person, you might now actually have a little bit of skin in the game now. That like, so some of this might blow back on you. Now is the time for courage. Now is the time for you to say like, I'm gonna stand up and like, I'm willing to take the risk, right? I'm willing to lose my job. I'm willing to, get written up. I'm willing to get known as that, like, gosh, not him again. Like,
but white boys love that shit too. White boys love it. They're like, yeah, fucking drag me. And you're like, all right, you're about to get dragged. And they come back, because y'all bounce back. That's also the same.
Right. But that's what I'm saying, right? I mean, but that's what I'm saying. It's to say that like, I'll be okay, right? It's like, I'm a young white man, and I mean, I'm not so young anymore, but I'm a white man in America, right? Like, at the end of the day, things are probably going to be okay, right? So, but it's about use that, right? Let's for those like white folks, now's the time to shine. A lot of people read a lot of books in the last 3 months. Like, now is the time to step up.
Whew, you are giving me everything today. And Millington, you are not annoying. I'm going to take you in meetings and I'm going to be like, we need to get Millington over here. Because that is,
I don't need to be president. It's not, we've had our time. Like, it's, let's get, you know, we give somebody else a shot.
I appreciate that too. Look at you making space. Look, all these examples. Folks, ask for examples. There we go. We are giving you everything today, everything that we have. So I would just like to thank you all for, this has been an amazing discussion. You have all given me a lot of, I feel like therapy today. I really feel like I'm in a better place than I was when I started my day, and I appreciate that. I'd like to thank Jamila White for really being the catalyst behind, and Chizzy, I know you are working in the background, always trying to promote things that we feel like are important discussions. There's a couple of announcements, I think. There's a survey. Your feedback is really important. Please take a moment to fill out the survey. This was recorded, so you can go back and listen to all of our ideas, all of the panelists' ideas and thoughts. Please email us for any other questions or ideas. You will see the email in the chat, and also that there is going to be a training, I think coming up September 29th. And so I think that was probably not my announcement to make, but I did anyway, and really appreciate everyone's time. This was a great discussion. And if there is nothing else, then I'll pass it over to Jamila. Do you want to just give us, is there anything else we need to close out?
I thank you all so much. This has been an amazing discussion. For the September 29th event, before I hand it over to Cheesy and Paul to close us out, we are having a conversation with SID institutional members, leaders, on how do we use this time in this moment to dismantle white supremacy from a systemic level. Because everyone we've invited put out a Black Lives Matter statement. And so we're gonna hold you accountable to what you put in those statements. So if you are working at SID institutional member organizations, please encourage your leaderships to join. It may be it may be max capacity right now, I'm not sure. Depending on how the first one goes, we may be having a second part series. And then, as Julie mentioned, we are going to be launching a new race ethnicity working group in SID, hopefully in early 2021, to carry on these topics. And so very excited to be able to do that. A lot of the legwork for that group came out of the work that we've been doing at the YPN network, as well as SID's Gender Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. So excited to see those changes. Would like to let my co-chair Cheesy introduce herself. And I just thank you all so much. And thank you, Paul, for fighting and working and advocating over the last year for us to have the opportunity to bring these topics to light.
Thank you, Jamila. I want to say thank you again to the panelists. Part one was amazing. If possible, part two was even better. We will be, as Jamila mentioned, there will be a new working group, but in the meantime, within YPN, we are still going to be working to bring events on this topic throughout the remainder of the year. I noted it in the chat, there are a few topics people mentioned, decolonizing, Mel and other things. So we've taken note of that. If you do have any topics that you are passionate about and you think YPN can bring light to, please feel free to reach out to either myself, Jamila, or Paul. And we'll be happy to chat with you about potentially making that a reality. So thank you all, and please subscribe and follow us for upcoming events.
And please follow us on Facebook as well. We have a YPN group, and if you ever want to be a moderator or a panel for any of our sessions, please let us know. We always like to have at least one professional, one young professional on our events. So over to
Great, thanks everyone. That was fantastic, and I thought it was going to be great, but it surpassed my expectations, like the last one did. So I'm very appreciative for everybody for their work in putting this together. As was mentioned, so there are a few things that were mentioned. I wasn't going to mention them, but I figured because it came up during the conversation, I might as well just provide some clarification. As Jamila mentioned, we're doing an event on September 29th. Unfortunately, that is open only to C-suite level staff. So I know a few people have already emailed us about it. We have to keep it a little bit because we're trying to have it be a very high level conversation. And as Jamila said, depending upon the success of it, we will try to replicate that possibly in the future. But in any event, we'll be doing many, many, many more events on similar topics, as Cheesy just mentioned. So there will be no shortage of these types of conversations moving forward. So that's the first thing. Next, around the race and the work group around diversity and anti-racism, we are working currently to construct that work group, construct the idea of what it will cover relative to the other work groups. As Jamila mentioned, we have a gender and inclusive development work group, so how it affects that. So we're trying to formulate that right now, and we'll hopefully have that put together sometime soon. I'm hoping it will be earlier than the beginning of next year, but hopefully that will be in the works, and hopefully we'll have that up and running soon. We will put out a call for work group co-chair, so there will be opportunities to be a work group co-chair. So again, if you're interested in that, stay tuned for that. You feel free to reach out to myself, Cheesy, Jamila, if you have any questions about what entails being a work group co-chair and what that actually looks like. So feel free to do that. And also, as was mentioned, apologies, I forgot who mentioned it. We do have a survey link that is listed in the chat box. I will post it again because it looks like it might have fallen down a little bit since there were a few more messages afterwards. But so here it is. So feel free to fill out the survey. We really would appreciate your feedback as we move forward and try to put together these events. Obviously, we want to have your input as we do these types of things. I can only, we're obviously can only say so much. We want to obviously be listening to what everybody's saying and want everyone to be contributing to what we're putting forward and what we're doing as an organization. So feel free to fill that out. If you have any recommendations, there's a suggestions box or comments box at the very end of the survey, so you can fill out any suggestions or comments or concerns that you have. And with that, thank you very much. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you at a future event. And as always, during these crazy and uncertain times, we hope you stay safe and healthy. So thank you.